Good morning, rock stars. Welcome back to String and Story. My name is HollyAnne Knight, and it's my job to guide you to quilt and to live with confidence. Welcome to an introduction to quilting plans. I am pulling y'all up on my computer as we speak. Oh my gosh, guys. If I gained 5 pounds instead of losing 5 pounds this month, I'm blaming Kristen Esser and Trader Joe's. Just for the record, Kristen, I hope you're watching this. I know you were voxing me a second ago, but I hope you see this because it'll be your fault if I don't fit into my summer shorts, because Kristen introduced me to 2 things. First of all, she introduced me to the Trader Joe's everything but the bagel seasoning. Hey, Sue Marie, which is awesome. If you've not, I don't even like everything bagels, and I love this seasoning, right? And then she told me to put it on fried eggs with avocado toast. So if I put on a bunch of weight, we're blaming Kristen. Are we good? Okay, cool. Hey, Lauren. Anyway, I bring that up because that's where I was. My stomach was growling, and I was like, I'm just gonna eat this piece of toast real quick. And I inhaled it, and thank heavens I looked in the mirror before I ran up here, because I was like, I'm late. I'm like, but I should look in the mirror and put lipstick on. And it's a good thing because I had avocado and egg all over my face. But we are here, and I am so excited to be here with you guys. Let me make sure I unpin last week's post. Let me get this shared. While I am sharing this over to the Quilting Rockstars, do me a favor, guys. Hit like or love on this video and then share it either to your personal page or to your favorite quilting group. That really helps more people come and join us, and it's a lot of fun when we have more people. Hey, Marianne. Hey, Rhoda. Yes, I'm so excited, Rhoda. You are in the right place, babe. All right, let me get this shared. Share in a group. I'm in one of those really groovy, really happy moods that makes me totally late to everything. Hey, Linda. Hey, Lori. Then I think I'm going to end up scooting y'all back just a little bit, because I feel like I'm just a talking head. Hang on. I have to scoot the quilt that's on the long arm out of the way. Okay. Now I can step back a little bit more. Oh, excellent. Hey, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, I will get you that link. I was in the car when you responded about the On Guard Cleaner Concentrate, which I wish I had a bottle in here. I would show you the bottle. Speaking of which, though, I am going to put something in my diffuser while I'm talking. But Elizabeth, I will get you that link. I have not forgotten. I just was dropping the boys off with my mom, and I have been... Ooh, let's do some Frankie and Wild Orange. I've been a crazy lady since. Ba-ba. How is everyone this morning? How is everyone? All right, while I am putting stuff in the diffuser, let me let you know what's in the caption of this video. The first thing is I announced last week's winner. So Lee Bayou, I hope I said your last name correctly. I probably did not, though, but that's okay. You won last week a copy of the Orion quilt pattern. Congratulations, dear. Please send me an email at stringandstory@gmail.com. Good morning, Terry. Oh yeah, it's so great. It's so great, Elizabeth, because it's not yucky. Hey, Teresa. It's not yucky. You know how some stuff just smells fake, and I'm putting frankincense on my head, guys. I didn't put my Frankie on this morning. Oh, that'll help me calm down. I'm a little hyper this morning. It's a good thing, though. It just means I'm having a good day. My natural happy state is hyper, so, you know. Much to the dismay of basically anyone who's ever known me. But except for maybe Lauren. Lauren, I feel like you get that. Because I feel like your natural happy state can be pretty hyper too. And I mean that as a compliment, babe, lest that be confusing. Alright, we've got some Frankie and Wild Orange going. So Lee, please send me an email. The rest of you, I'm turning the tables on the question of the week. The question of the week this week is for you to ask me a question about quilting plans. I put some basics. Yep, Lauren, I knew you would get that. I knew you'd understand. The question of the week is for you to ask me a question about quilting plans. I put some basics inside today's blog post. Guys, this is just cracking me up. So I was hesitant to even write a new blog post for today because I've written about quilting plans a couple of times. And if you type in quilting plan in the search bar of my blog, you'll find them. And the stuff that I had to share with you guys today, I was pretty sure I'd said before. So I went and searched my blog a couple days ago and was like, all right, let me see which one of these has the list I'm thinking of. And I'll just link to that one for this week because, you know, I don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? I couldn't find it, and I realized that maybe I hadn't put this in writing anywhere. Part of it I know is inside, and maybe that's where I'm thinking it is. I know some of it is inside How to Make a Quilting Plan, which we're going to talk about a little bit today. It's one of my online classes. Some of it had not been put out on the blog, and so I felt like this was an important blog post to talk through some like basics of like, what is a quilting plan? How do we even get started with that? And what are some things to consider? And we basically are gonna stop today right where How to Make a Quilting Plan picks up. It's a class I highly encourage you guys to take, especially if you've already taken beginner free motion quilting. It's your natural next step. If you have not taken beginner, I would consider starting there. And I'll explain to you why as we go, and the explanation's in the blog as well. Then there's a link to the blog and there's a link to my classes. So there's the relevant links for this week. Let me greet everyone else who has jumped in with us. Hey, Anne. I feel like I may have missed some of you guys. Hey, Veronica. Hey, Lucinda. Happy Easter week. Happy Maundy Thursday. Do we say happy for that? I don't know. It's culturally significant, so maybe happy. Okay. Y'all, I'm so distracted and thrilled by the quilts behind me. Sorry. All right, let's jump in. Quilting plans. First of all, what is a quilting plan and why the heck do we need to make one, right? One of the most common questions I get, hey Doc, hey Lisa, hey Laura, I see you guys. One of the most common questions that I get is, I like the idea of finishing my quilts, but how the heck do I know what to quilt where, right? This is one of the biggest questions that I get. And my answer to that is, well, you make a quilting plan. Then the follow-up question is like, what the hey is that? So let's talk about that. A quilting plan is a drawing of your quilt where you can draw out what you're going to quilt on it and make all your decisions on paper before you quilt your quilt. Think of this, think back to when you were in school. Kristen's voxing me again. She's probably telling me that I shouldn't blame her if I gain weight, but I totally am. If you weren't here for that part of the beginning, don't worry about it. Think back to college when you had big essays to write, right? And you didn't just sit down and jump in to writing the paper, right? That wouldn't necessarily work. It would take a lot longer. Your ideas wouldn't flow. Like even if you sat down and were like, okay, I'm writing a paper on moral absolutes in Gothic literature of the 19th century. This is basically what my senior thesis was on. So I didn't just like pull that out of nowhere, but moral absolutes in Gothic literature, British Gothic literature of the 19th century, right? Hey, Bonnie. If I just start with, okay, I need an introduction and then I'm going to make some arguments and a conclusion, if I try to just jump straight into writing, I'm going to waste a lot of time, right? I'm going to have to move a lot of things around. I'm going to have incomplete ideas. Making sure that I finish all my thoughts isn't going to work real well, right? So what we do first is what? If you were here, hopefully all of you would be screaming at me, take notes or research or outline or some element of that, right? This is the pre-writing. That's what a quilting plan is. It's the pre-quilting. Okay, so you're taking, your desired finished project, your quilt, and I'm using this one as an example. This is not one of my patterns. This is one of Natalia Bonner's patterns that I pattern tested for her a couple of years ago. Maybe just a year ago. It might have just been a year ago. But I'm using this as an example because it's what's going on my long arm tonight. And so I've been working on this quilting plan this week. I think one of y'all yelled at me at outline. Yes! Lauren! That was a virtual high five. I should do that more often. That felt really epic. Hey, Jenny. Hey, Connie. Ooh, I see some great questions. I will scoot back to those. Excellent. Where was I? This is our pre-writing, right? So your desired finished object, your quilt, and you're auditioning ideas, right? You can see on here, this section, right? I knew that I wanted to do something special in these larger pink triangles. And so the first thing that I did is I just drew a bunch of motifs that I could potentially do in those larger pink triangles. And I did, I'm not going to quilt them all differently like this. Yeah, Lauren, you got this virtual high five thing. But I'm auditioning ideas, right? This is like if I do a brain dump, right? When I've got kind of scribbles of bits on my quilting plan doodles, this is my brain dump. And as I work my way around the quilt, you'll start to see over on this side, order is starting to come out of chaos. This is what I'm probably going to actually end up doing, right? So I've got some switchbacks, these little loop-de-loops, some feathers. But over on this side, this was just a bunch of trying stuff out, seeing what stuck to the wall, right? So our brain dump, we start to refine it. Then when this quilt goes on my long arm tonight, I have done the hard work. That is the significance of a quilting plan. You do all the hard work. This is just like when you wrote an essay in college, right? Those of you who I know were essay people, get this. That the hardest part was your research, your note-taking, and your outlining. And when that was done, sitting down to write the paper was a breeze. And so, much to the dismay of many of my professors, I usually wrote my papers a day or two before they were due. Not because I hadn't been working on them, but because I spent all that other time doing the hard stuff. And then I would ruminate on it for a little bit, and then I'd write the paper. And I quilt just like I wrote papers, okay? Now, I will say my timeline is often a little more condensed, but usually what happens is I've pieced the quilt, right? So that's a big chunk of time. That's the going to class, the reading the books, right? I make my quilting plan, or I at least start tossing ideas around. I start doodling things on the paper, seeing what sticks up against the wall. I put the quilt on the long arm or up on the design wall, and I just walk past it a lot, right? And then I get something down on paper, and then I sit on it a little bit longer. I walk past it a few more times. I usually give it a day or so, right? So I drafted this quilting plan yesterday, and I've let it sit. I looked at it this morning. I still like it. Therefore, my hard work is done. And hard work with quilting consists of two things, right? It consists of learning the motifs, and this is in the blog post, so I know I'm doing my little fire hose number here, but the hard work of quilting is two things: learning your motifs. This is why I mentioned at the top that I would recommend taking beginner free motion quilting before you take how to make a quilting plan. Okay, you have to have a toolbox, right? You have to read the books if you're in school, or at least read significant portions of the books, right? I'm not necessarily a cover-to-cover person in academia, but that's a whole nother argument. So learn your motifs, done that hard work, and make your quilting plan. So you've taken your tools, you've decided how you're going to apply them to this particular quilt. So when I load this quilt, the dark quilt, which I should hold it up for you guys so you can see it, it's huge, so you're only going to get to see part of it at a time. But you guys get the idea. There's those pink triangles we were talking about. This is the one for my bed, guys, because we all know the cobbler's children have no shoes, and you know my bed doesn't have its own quilt yet. So, well, En Provence has been on it for a while, but it needs its own official quilt. So when I load that on the long arm tonight, there's a decent chance I'll get that puppy quilted in just a day or two, because the hard work will be done, right? This is honestly, like, for those of you who have chosen to send quilts long arming to me for long arming, the longest part of the process in all likelihood will be the time I will spend with your quilt draped over my long arm frame walking by it, right? Because I want to make sure that I know what it needs to look like before I start quilting on it, right? This is one of the most difficult parts of any of my quilts, but it's exciting. It's really, really exciting. Okay. How do I get started? Great question. Recommendation for an electronic quilt plan. Oh, that's a great question, Bonnie. Which parts do you start off with? Ooh, I love it, I love it, I love it. Okay, these are really great. Okay, so Marianne, I'm going to go ahead and answer your question. How much time do you need to take the quilting plan class? I mean, honestly, if you just sat down and did it, you could get through it in an afternoon easily. Think of it as taking a 6-hour class at a local quilt shop, right? So beginner free motion quilting, intro to free motion quilting. Okay, intro is like a 3-hour class at your local quilt shop. Beginner and how to make a quilting plan, intro to color theory, those are more like 6-hour classes at your local quilt shop, just to give you like a perspective of the amount of content that's in there. Now, the difference with it being digital content is you could literally just sit there and click through and watch the videos and not do any work, and that would take less than 6 hours, right? But if you do the work I ask of you, and if you actually draw quilting plans for some of your tops, then it's about a 6-hour class worth of work, just to give you some context. All right. So that is what a quilting plan is. How do we get started? As I mentioned, I spend a lot of time just walking by my quilts, and I've built up my toolbox, right, of all my quilting motifs. The more quilting motifs you feel confident quilting, this is why Rockstar Status, which shortly will be known as Rockstar Status 1, because I am ruminating on ideas for a second installation of that. But this is the reason why part 1 focuses heavily on motifs, right? Absolutely, Marianne. It's because I want you to have your toolbox. And if you have your toolbox, you can start playing and figure out how to put them on a quilt. Though I do think how to make a quilting plan is extremely valuable because I take it shape by shape just to give you ideas of the way I fit shapes and motifs together, okay? Where to begin? Just start drawing, right? I know you're like, HollyAnne, can't you give me like a little bit of something? Pick your favorite part of the quilt that you want to emphasize and start there. Right, so remember I mentioned to you guys that I really wanted to emphasize these pink triangles, that to me that was the most significant part of the quilt, right? And what was happening over here and why this quilting plan didn't work well is because the motifs I was drawing inside the pink triangles, my immediate thought was I want to make sure that I leave them with as little quilting as possible so they pop. Right, and I dive deep into this and how to make a quilting plan, but depending on how much you quilt something, you literally change the depth of that section of the quilt, right? So I'm thinking, well, I want the pink triangles to stand out, therefore I should quilt them less. But the problem is, with this, that feathers are way more interesting to look at. And so what I was going to end up doing was putting more emphasis than intended on the negative space of this quilt. So I had to switch it. And you'll see over here in the quilting plan I'm actually planning on using, I still kept the background more densely quilted than my pink triangles, right? Those switchbacks are going to be tighter and thus more smooshed, but they're also less visually interesting, right? Like straight lines get really boring really fast, but feathers are super fascinating. And so I've chosen to do feathers in the pink triangles, something a little less interesting like these loop-de-loops in the gray and blue, and then just switchbacks and all the negative space, because that makes the negative space really, really boring to look at, right? I'm going to hold this up so you guys can picture that a little bit. So picture really gorgeous big feathers and these pink triangles, and then lots of switchbacks and all the negative space, right? That's going to make for a much more interesting look than if all the feathers are in the negative space. Because people are going to be squinting trying to see what's going on back there. And I don't want them doing that. I want them to go, ooh, those pink triangles and the way that it moves towards the center of the quilt, right? So start with your favorite part of the quilt and try to figure out how you want to quilt that first. Or if you're really unsure about that, so I've got one of y'all's quilts, who I actually haven't sent this quilting plan to yet. Claire, I think it's your quilt. You sent me Good Fortune, right? So I haven't run this by Claire yet, so I don't know if she likes this idea yet. Therefore, I don't know if I will actually be quilting it this way. But my recommendation for her Good Fortune quilt would actually be, because Bonnie's pieces on that are so small. Here, I'll hold up a block, one of my blocks, so you can see it, because her top is down in the box. But if you remember, these Good Fortune pieces are really, really little. So my recommendation for her Good Fortune top is actually that we quilt all the negative space and push it back, and let all those colors come forward, more like a mosaic, right? Haven't run that by Claire yet, so that's not set in stone. But that may be a time where what I want to emphasize is the color, and so I'm gonna literally, I can afford the luxury of leaving pieces this small totally unquilted, and just push all this down with some lovely little motifs to make the rest of it go, right? All right, I'm seeing questions. Let me catch up on these questions real quick. Oh yeah, Rhoda, that's a great question. Great question. Oh, your questions are so great. Lauren, I'll talk to you later, babe. I know I owe you like 3 emails. I will get to them, I promise. My inbox is like right now, which is good. Let me pause on that for, this is a total sidebar. But I know sometimes when I say my inbox is like this and I haven't gotten back to someone, that sounds like a bad thing. That's a good thing. That means you guys are talking to me and I love it. So please, by all means, keep my inbox full. Just know it may take me a day or 2 to get back to you. Just total sidebar. Hey, Winifred. All right, I'm gonna jump through the rest of the bits I mentioned in this blog, and then I'm gonna focus just on y'all's questions because I think it's wonderful. 3 big things that I want you to think about as you are choosing your motifs. Now remember, motif by motif, shape by shape, all of that is inside How to Make a Quilting Plan. I'm not going to do it here because, as I mentioned, that's like a 6 hours class worth of content, right? And it would be overwhelming to try to do it like this. But I encourage you to take both beginner and how to make a quilting plan so that you can develop your toolbox of motifs and develop your ability to pair those with shapes on your quilt, right? But as far as big picture things I want you to consider, one, what is this quilt's purpose, right? What is it gonna do? Are you submitting it to a show? I've got a couple of quilts that y'all have sent me that you do want to submit them to shows, right? Those are gonna get quilted differently than the quilt your dog is gonna lay on, right? Do you wanna hang it on your wall? Is it gonna go on your bed? How big is it, right? Is it a big bed quilt? Is it a little lap quilt? All of these things matter, and it matters for a couple of reasons. One, you may not want to spend 15 hours of your life quilting something, even if it's for your own bed, if you know your dog is going to lay on it all the time. On the other hand, you might be like me, and I know I'm the oddball in this, right? You might be like me that I'm like, I absolutely am going to spend a lot of time quilting the quilts we use a lot because they make awesome practice opportunities, right? Quilts that I know are really mostly meant for our family are awesome practice opportunities because if I mess it up, well, a kid's probably going to puke on it anyway. You know, so there's room for grace if you look at it that way. So two different sides of the same coin. I just want you to consider it. You may prefer to sleep under quilts that are less densely quilted. You may really like feeling the fluff of the loft of your batting, right? I really love the heaviness of a densely quilted quilt. I think that's the freaking best. Now, I do use battings that naturally start with a little bit more loft, right? I love the Hobbs Cotton Supreme. I love the Hobbs Cotton Wool. Both of these start fluffier. So even when I quilt them pretty densely, I do still have loft while also having the weight of the quilting. And I use 100% cotton thread. Thank you, Aurifil. And that keeps the suppleness and the drape. Did you like that little, ooh, that makes my arms look funny. The suppleness and the drape of the quilt, even though it's densely quilted, okay? So think about the purpose of the quilt. And do you want to spend that much time quilting it? Now, my one exception to this is, in general, I do not custom quilt quilts for kids. Unless I very specifically am wanting the practice or there's a particular significance to the quilt, right? So like, for example, I have custom quilted some quilts for Cure Quilts, but I was using them as practice, right? So they get the added bonus of some extra visual interest with the quilting. It's a practice, I'm stretching my technique. So if it's imperfect, I know kids have a lot of grace when they look at things, right? Jim's quilt happens to be custom quilted because I did a Lanterns of Hope for him and we quilted it together and I was taking you guys through the motifs of beginner free motion quilting, right? But in general, quilts for kids, I'm way more likely to choose an all over design because nobody destroys a quilt faster than a child. That is a good thing. Okay, it's a good thing for your kids to destroy their quilts because that means they're using it and they love it. The unfortunate thing about kids, remember the story of the Velveteen Rabbit? Kids destroy things they love. They love them to death, right? And us as grown-ups are like, oh, if you love it, maybe you should take better care of it. But all they know is that they're pouring all their love for it literally into it until it just fades under the weight of the love. Right? So this is not at all a knock on kids destroying quilts. It's just I want you to weigh that, and I'm way more likely to go with an all-over motif because I don't want to inhibit my child from using his quilt, right? I want to be like, by all means, take it outside and use it as a picnic blanket next to your construction site and get it all muddy, right? Like, we do life with our quilts. All right. Second, process. I promise I'm going to answer all your questions, so keep them coming because they're awesome. I love your questions. I can see a couple of them as they've popped in. Process. How will you be quilting it? Right? Again, this is like 100 inches square. Okay? If I were quilting this on my domestic now, I would still consider custom quilting it because I'm on the Juki J150, right? But when I was on my Singer Quantum Stylus, I love my Singer Quantum Stylus. Y'all know this. But a 5.5 inch throat space is not conducive to custom quilting a queen size quilt. Could I probably still quilt it myself? Yes, but it's gonna be time consuming and I'm gonna wanna keep it simple, just for the sake of my sanity and also my shoulders, right? So think about the size of your quilt, how you're quilting it. How much do you like the quilting process, right? I've had a couple of y'all, and I so dearly love your honesty in this, that you have taken beginner free motion quilting, or maybe you've even taken, there's a few of you that have taken intro with me in person, or you've even taken rockstar status, and you get to the end and you say, I am so glad I did that. I'm so glad I have the skills. If I need them, I have them. However, I don't love it. I don't love it. I would rather piece, and I would rather quilt by check. And if you have the means and the desire to do that, girl, this is your quilting party, and you get to do what you want to. Okay, so be honest with yourself. If you don't love custom quilting, so like let's say this was your quilt, 100-inch square queen quilt, you're super pumped, you want it custom quilted, but you don't love custom quilting, then one of two things needs to happen. Either you don't custom quilt it, as in you do something that's not custom, or you don't custom quilt it, you pay somebody else to custom quilt it, right? So think about the process, think about how you're gonna be doing it, or you might think to yourself, I really don't like custom quilting on my domestic because it's just too taxing on my body. However, I love custom quilting on the long arm, and it's worth it to me to pay for the rental time to go down there and custom quilt it there, right? Weigh all these things. So the final purpose, the process of getting there, quilting is supposed to be a hobby that we love, right? Or in my case, a job that I love, right? Which it is. I love it, right? So make choices that allow you to love the process. Even if your choices are different than mine, or different than your best friend's, or different than Lydia's or Lisa's, right? Like, you make your best choice for your process to make sure that you love what you're doing with your quilts, all right? Final thought on this, big picture thought. The final product. Yes, I did 3 P's on purpose. Yes, I lost 30 minutes of sleep this morning laying in bed staring at the ceiling trying to think of the 3rd P because I knew what I wanted to say, but I had to think of a word. So product. How do you want the final product to look, right? What are you wanting to emphasize? Think about, this is actually I haven't rolled this quilt yet, so don't judge me, but y'all recognize this beauty, this giant beauty we've been working on together. Right, think about what you want the final product to look like. This is a very bold, geometric, graphical quilt. So that immediately gets me thinking about super curvy, feminine, natural designs to offset it, right? So I've got my paisleys up here in the red. Can y'all see that at all? A little bit. I've got swirls and switchbacks and feathers. I've got swirls over here, right? So I immediately started thinking of really curvy, feminine designs that we're going to contrast with the geometry of this quilt, okay? At the same time, I didn't want to take away from the geometry of this quilt. So I only used 4 motifs on this whole quilt, right? Notice that 2 of them are from intro, 1 is from beginner, and only the feathers are from rockstar status. Though I have a feather tutorial on my blog, so you could take beginner and still be able to do this quilt, right? So I've got the swirls from intro and switchbacks from intro. Feathers we do in rockstar, or you can see the little one-off tutorial on my blog, and then paisleys are from beginner, right? So just 4 motifs because I wanted to add a lot of texture and visual interest and this kind of more organic element into this quilt, but without taking away from the geometry. Another option would have been to do really highly custom quilting where I create shapes and quilt them, and that could have looked really cool. That just wasn't what I was going for with this quilt, right? That is what I want to go for on this quilt. That's why it's not quilted yet, because it's going to take forever. But I want to do like big geometrical shapes that have nothing to do with the seam lines, right? So again, taking that into account when you're making this quilting plan. Did you spend $837,400, whatever? Did you spend a lot of hours piecing it? Then you're probably going to want to do one of 2 things, right? Remember my otter quilt, my Orion quilt with the teeny tiny otters that I paper pieced, right? That one, I spent a gazillion hours piecing it, and I wanted to highlight that by keeping the quilting as simple as possible. Just wavy lines, right? So that when people look at it, they very quickly mentally dismiss the quilting, they're ignoring that, and they're looking at the piecing. The other opportunity would be to highly custom quilt, right? My first version of Sirius, I did a lot of custom quilting of pebbles and whatnot to emphasize all these little stars that I took so long to piece, right? So if you're probably going to want to go one direction or the other, all right? So purpose for the quilt, the process of quilting the quilt, and how you want the final product to look. Look at those things. big up high. Your big takeaway today, real quick before I jump into the questions, your big takeaway today is that the vast majority of custom quilting, of making a quilting plan, of making these decisions yourself is not as difficult as we often act like it is, right? I think this is an area where that inner critic loves to like dive in, boom, lands, parachute, right? And just like, you can't do that. That's too hard and complicated. Okay, what do we do with that voice? We take a bolt of fabric. We don't have time for that, right? The big secret here is to practice on paper before you practice on your quilt. You get as many dress rehearsals as you want, right? If you have to draw that dang quilt 100 times before you like the quilting plan, you can do this, right? You could fill up this whole notebook with nothing but quilting plans of your one quilt if you're getting your legs under you. It gets easier every time. Guys, true confessions, this red and white quilt, I didn't actually draw the quilting plan. That's one of very few times that I just didn't even draw it. Why? Because I could see it in my head from the get-go, right? But the reason for that is that I've spent 2 years drawing every single quilting plan I've executed, right? That's an extremely rare thing that I wouldn't draw it. So make use of your paper and pen, your paper and pencil, get your markers, colored pencils out, and allow yourself to have a dress rehearsal. Make all your decisions on paper. You've got this. Remember, we're doing the hard work before we get to the quilt. So by the time we get to the quilt, it's just executing, right? You just follow the plan, right? All right. Let me jump into these marvelous questions that you guys have been asking. I'm going to scroll up to the top to make sure I don't miss any. Favorite way to incorporate quilting negative space? That's a great question, Dana Lee. Let me think. I'm trying to think of the quilts I've done that have the most negative space in them. That's probably this one, and this one I did not do as much with as you could. I know I've been looking at a lot of pictures on Pinterest, on Instagram, etc., of folks who create new things in the negative space, and I really like that. So I think my inclination with negative space is to go one of two directions, right? I either keep it extremely simple. Think about how I'm doing the switchbacks with this, right? I'm keeping it very, very simple so that it fades. Or you can create entirely new things, right? I love following C. Sherilyn So over on Instagram, and she's been doing this thing recently where she like takes these like pebbly feather bits and fades them into this cross hatching and then fades it back out, and it looks mind-bogglingly cool. That's something, okay, this is just like honesty moment, like full disclosure. That's something I'm still working on. It's something I'm super interested in, but I've executed it very few times, right? I'm still in my dress rehearsal stage. That's why I really want to do it on this quilt, because it's something I've been looking at and studying for probably a year now. And there's only one quilt I can think of where I did that extensively, and I really want to do it again and really get my feet under myself about that. Okay, Marianne is about a 6-hour class. I already answered that. Lucinda, I love this tip. So for those of you who are working on a domestic, Lucinda talks about working from the center out, and I highly recommend this because you're a lot less likely to get puckers. You're not going to have as much of the quilt up under your throat space at one time, etc. So think of your quilt in either quarters or even halves, depending on the way you're quilting it, and try to quilt one chunk at a time. Now, if you're doing something, because remember, when I'm working on a long arm, I'm working in rows, right? So bottom left, or top left to bottom right. But if you are, let me see if I can find, oh, here's the quilt that I did that was, well, if I can find the actual drawing of what I did. Nope, apparently not. I'm trying to find my En Provence quilting plan. Here we go. So when I quilted my Bonnie Hunter En Provence, right, I did every block the same, and I looped them together as I moved in rows across the quilt. And if you're doing that on a domestic, you'll do the same thing, but you'll do it in halves or quarters, right? So if you divide it into, here, this is a, so if I was doing serious, right, here is well, I can't do it into a true quarter if I want to do it block by block. So let's say I'm going to do a set of 2 blocks and then a set of 3 blocks. I would quilt this block into this block, into this block, into this block, or this block, and right? So I would still work in like this continuous fashion, but then I would stop and I would do it again over here. And then I would do it again over here, right? So it's the same principle of finding sets to work in if you're doing a 1-block quilt where you're quilting every block the same way. You're just not going to do full rows at a time, top to bottom. You're just going to do little sections of blocks so that you can start from the center and work out, right? It works a little better under the domestic that way. Hey, Jackie. When you do your plan, what parts do you start off with? The blocks, the negative space? Usually the parts I love. Alternately, if there's a part of the quilt that has really stood out to me that it knows what it wants to be. For example, on this red and white quilt, the white knew it wanted feathers. And yes, I'm personifying the quilt in this, but you know, for all its woo-ness, which you may or may not feel very woo about your quilts. I tend to feel rather woo about my quilts. So I really do like to lay them out and see what starts talking to me, right? And really what that means is when I start visualizing on the quilt and wherever I get an idea of like, oh, this section needs to have this motif, then I can build from there. So it's a little different with every quilt. Sometimes it starts that way. Sometimes like on the dark quilt, I knew I wanted the pink triangles to be the part people really paid attention to. Sometimes I just know that the negative space needs to go to the back to let something else shine and I can go from there, right? You'll find your entry point, and again, this is all a muscle, right? I had a talk with Jem. Oh, I'm totally giving away my newsletter tomorrow, but that's okay. I had a talk with Jem this week about his pickup muscle, which obviously is not a real muscle in your body. This is, you know, a character development kind of muscle. But when we first got the robot vacuum after Christmas, we were super good about making the boys pick up their toys in the playroom every evening, even if they were tired, and they got really good at it, right? It started out difficult, but over the course of several weeks, it got to where we could be like, hey, it's time to go pick up the playroom so the robot vacuum can go, and they would like do it, right? Well, we kind of fell off the bandwagon a few weeks ago. And when I asked Jim and Ian to pick up on Monday, like all hell broke loose, right? And why? Because their pickup muscle atrophied. Right? They hadn't been practicing. And these skills that we practice, this just do it, this like, let's just tackle this and get it over with or whatever, all of these are muscles within our character, right? And it's the same with our quilting. That something like making a quilting plan, it's your quilting plan muscle, right? And the first couple that you do, it's gonna feel like pulling teeth. Like I will just be fully honest with you on that, right? But each time it's gonna get a little bit easier, and you'll find that when you're piecing a quilt, you start thinking ahead. And you start noticing like, oh, I wonder what would happen if I did this. And sometimes I keep a notebook handy when I'm piecing. And I just start kind of jotting ideas or doodling ideas and bring all those together at the end for the quilting plan. Hopefully that is helpful. Bonnie, do you have any recommendations for an electronic quilt plan app? I would like to take a photo and use an app. All right, so this will answer one of the questions that Elizabeth answered as well. My friend Sherilyn, so CSEA_Sherilyn, SHERILYN_SEW, Sherilyn Mortensen. She takes pictures of her quilts or draws her quilts on her iPad and uses an iPad pencil. And I don't remember what app she uses. I don't remember the exact app. I've used like the markup app that just comes on your iPhone, right? And my finger, because I don't have an Apple Pencil, which is terribly imprecise. But if you have an iPad and an Apple Pencil, you could literally do it right there. So take a photo and go to Edit Photo and the Open Markup and doodle right on there. Totally an option. Yeah, great question. All right, let me make sure. All right, Nancy, hopefully I answered how to get started. Great question, babe. How many designs do you try to put on paper, or how many designs do you put on paper to try out before you make a final choice? Great question, Suzanne. It totally depends on the quilt, right? Let me see if I can find some good examples in here. So this, like, I've obviously been working on several different ideas over the last few days, right? Oh, here's the one that I was trying to find to show you guys a minute ago. So here's This one, it took 3, right? I did this Blue Stars quilt. Here's one real feathery, complicated thing. Here's a super simple loopy meander. And what I actually landed on was this is what I was talking about with respect to negative space. If I created entirely new things in what would have otherwise just been like a white section or in between here, right? So in that case, it was 3 iterations. Yeah, so it kind of depends. Anywhere from 1 to 3 or more. I'm flipping through to see if I have anywhere I did more than 1. Sometimes the thing that I'll do, and thus it's not fully recorded in my sketchbook, is I'll literally sit there with the quilt top in front of me and kind of trace things with my finger as well and start to mull on ideas before I start drawing, right? But do as many as you need to do. But there's also not a minimum. If you look at your quilt top and you know how you want to quilt it, I would recommend drawing it. Obviously, I broke my own rule with this red and white quilt, so take this with a grain of salt. But I would recommend drawing it, just because sometimes I draw things like here. I really thought that I wanted this loopy loop in my, like, all of the triangles that have color, like everything that's not white. And when I drew it out, I realized that I hated that it was not going to give me the effect that I wanted, right? But I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't drawn it first. And this is part of why this quilt hasn't been quilted, is because I'd been pretty sure that's what I wanted, but hadn't taken the time to draw and troubleshoot. And then when I did, I was like, shoot, I got to go back to the drawing board on that. All right. One thing other quilters mentioned is the need to keep the quilting equal throughout the quilt. What are your feelings on this? I mean, I don't know that I would recommend having like feathers in one area. Try to figure out the best way to answer this. I think you could, if you go too far on the extremes, yes, this could be problematic, right? Because then your quilt's gonna like shrink funny in the wash, the batting could shift funny over time. But I definitely have some variety in how densely I quilt things. I mean, you can see even what I'm gonna be doing here, like these feathers and these little loop-de-loops are much less densely quilted than the switchbacks. And yet the quilt as a whole will be consistent, right? Because of the way that I've designed that. What you really want to avoid is, so you know how Lanterns of Hope is a color wash? What you would not want to do is leave this very lightly quilted, this white, you can't see the white because it's right off camera, but the white up here, to very lightly quilt that and let your quilting get denser as it goes down. Don't do that. I'm not entirely sure what'll happen to your quilt, but I know that it'll be weird. Like, it'll just wash funny. I don't think it would be square. You're gonna have issues with batting as you go. So you can play with washes of color all you want, but I would not play with washes in your quilting density, if that makes sense. So the net of your quilting across the quilt surface probably needs to be pretty even, but each individual area, like I even mentioned on Good Fortune, that I really would love to, if it's not Claire's, then maybe even my own, to quilt all the white and not quilt the colors, right? So hopefully that makes sense. Oh, absolutely, March. How do you adjust your choice if there's a lot of seams in the blocks? This is a great question. There's a couple of things you can do. One, if things have really bulky seams, thank you, Bonnie, I'm actually more likely to go a little bit more custom, because I can choose, which Dana Lou, I see that you asked this question as well. I'm likely to go a little bit more custom because then I can choose what seams I'm hopping over, right? Like, I'm not going to go through the center point when I quilt this because, hello, that's just so much, which, like, how cute that there's a little pinwheel on the back, but good Lord, right? So instead, I'm gonna be trying to make sure that I can jump through these areas out here rather than having to jump across that middle, right? If at all possible. So going a little bit more custom, making sure that even if you're not going super custom, just plan ahead where those bulky seams are and do your best to avoid them, right? If you do need to go over a super bulky seam, sometimes it just happens. There's a couple of things you can do. One, if you have one of those even glide foots, it's like a little clear spoon with a hole in the middle for your needle. That's going to go over bulky seams a lot better. I don't have one yet. I usually use ruler feet to do my quilting, right? But if you have one of those, that's going to help a lot. Other things is, honestly, I use a hammer on my seams when they're really bulky. Now, I often will put my hand underneath the quilt rather than doing this on a surface. Put my hand underneath it and whack it with a hammer. Obviously, you can only hit so hard. Please don't hurt your hand. But it also helps you not damage anything else and not damage your quilt top by whacking it too much, right? We don't want to like scrape it up or anything like that. And finally, just slow way down. And if necessary, use a ruler to guide your foot right through the seam real slow, okay? Take it real easy. Yeah, that's the hardest thing. Oh my gosh, Marianne, that is precious about Winnie the Pooh. Precious, precious. So March, if you're working on the domestic, I generally advise it. However, if you guys have been on any social hours lately, you know that I am a shameless rule breaker, so feel free to break my rules. So if you're like, I like the idea of working from the center out, but that does not work with how I want to quilt this quilt, then ignore me and do what you want to do, right? Just know the possible risk is that your quilt is more likely to shift when you're working on a domestic, right? You're more likely to end up with shifting that kind of pulls down towards that bottom right, okay? So just be mindful of that as you're working. You might consider, if you really do want to do your quilting from top left to bottom right, you may implement another rule, a trump card, if you will. And quilt in between your blocks, like stitch in the ditch, and stabilize everything really well beforehand. I do not always do that. In fact, I very rarely do that. But this might be a good opportunity to do it so that you don't have to worry about shifting, and then you can follow your quilting plan as it makes more natural sense to you. So there is a workaround. The other thing you're gonna have to think about though is you're more likely to end up with bulk under your throat space. So just keep that in mind as you're going along, okay? Most important, yes, you can set up my quilt. Throw it in the trunk and use it. Yes, 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 yes. An unused pot has no life. Yes. Okay, I don't know how many of y'all watched Sherlock, but it might be the very first episode of Sherlock. Hey, Jan, great to see you, friend. The very first episode of Sherlock, right, involves this mystery surrounding a woman who works at a museum, right? And her job is the Chinese teapots, is preserving them. And what is very unique about these teapots is they must be used. And this is exactly what, Elizabeth, what your brother's talking about, right? That the clay will actually dry out too much and begin to crack and disintegrate if it is not regularly used. And so at the museum, she gives these demonstrations with 5,000-year-old teapots where she literally makes tea in them every day because the best way to preserve it is to use it. Right? And this is loving the life into something, right? So on the one hand, our children tend to love our quilts to death. On the other hand, they're also loving life into them, right? And remember, another way to think about it might be that you quilted the life in. I've talked about this with you guys some of like, I really do think there's something, this is rooted in my faith, but it's also just rooted in the fact that I tend to be a little bit woo, right? So whichever side of that you want to take from, go for it. But I really do think that something happens when we make a quilt for someone, right? I think if you're praying over a quilt, there's power in that. But I also just think the human act of creation puts you and your love and your care into your quilts, right? And so from a faith perspective, I look at this pneuma, the breath of life, right? When God created us, that he put his breath in us. And we, because we're made in his image, are also creators, and we put a bit of our breath into the things that we make. Right? Or however you want to interpret that. But this is something I think about, right? And so what you could also think about with people loving your quilts to death is they're pulling the love out of the quilt, right? And what's left, if the quilt ends up stained and torn and kind of in tatters, is really just the shell. Because what was valuable about that quilt was the love that you put into it. And it has been pulled out and pulled into the person you love. Okay? So think about this from different angles. All right, and I'll get off my soapbox. I just get really excited. I love these questions, guys. These are so great. Thank you, Dana Lou. I really do feel like it was magic because this was one of those like muse moments if I was quilting along and I did half the feather and then was like, and the other half needs to be switchbacks. Like that wasn't the plan. I was just gonna do feathers. And then this happened and I do feel like it's magic. I really, really, really like it. I will be doing it again, just for the record. Cheaper to make changes on paper. Amen, Lori. Amen, Lori. Becky, yes, the quilting plan class is entirely online. It is on demand, and once you buy it, you own it. So you can go back to it and watch it 3,700 times. Yeah. Oh, no worries, Becky. And then, of course, I recommend jumping in and out of the Quilting Rockstars and share the work that you're doing because it's always fun to get to talk about it with friends, right? Yes, see Sherilyn, so Elizabeth, I spelled it a hot second ago. Hey, Terry. Do you ever rip out if you really can't live with it? I largely rip out for only one thing. Some of y'all are just gonna die. About the only thing that I will rip out for is if my tension is really horrendously bad. Right? If I've got floating thread where that twist did not land in the center of the quilt, or if I have eyelashes on the top or back, I will rip out for that. That's about the only thing I will rip out for. On my quilts. Let me clarify that. On my quilt. If I'm quilting for someone else, particularly if I know that the destination of that quilt is a show, or just a very special occasion, I will be more precise than I am with my own quilts. To some extent, every quilt I make for myself is a practice quilt. Right? Like when I'm making any of these quilts and sharing them with you guys, this is me practicing in public, right? When I put y'all on the long arm and we're quilting together and the pebble doesn't come out perfectly round or overlaps the next pebble or whatever, this is me practicing in public for you guys, right? Because this is part of how we all learn and grow, is it's imperfect. And if I demand perfection of every quilt that I quilt, or every point that I stitch, right, I will never get anything done. So I tend to fall on the opposite extreme, that it has to be really, really bad for me to go back and rip it out. Now, I've had a couple of times where I've been quilting along, God bless Hubster, I scare really easily, so it's not really him, it's me. And I'll be quilting along, I'm listening to my audiobook, my back's to the door, right? And he'll come in and I'll go, right? And like off goes the long arm, and I will pick that out. Right? Like, obviously, I'm not going to just leave that in there. But I tend to go to the opposite extreme of, rather than requiring near perfection of everything I do and obsessing over it and taking forever over it, I just make a crap ton of quilts. Like a lot of quilts. And therefore, they don't have to be perfect because I'll just make the next one. Right? So. You had no problem with, oh, the even glide foot, Lisa? And it went right over Good Fortune. Ooh, that might make it worth investing in. That's really exciting. Thank you. I've been debating on that. Hey, Jan. Densely quilted wall hanging ended up with waving sides. How do you flatten them after the fact? Okay, so Marion, this is going to get into blocking your quilt, where before you put the binding on, and I don't remember how much you're supposed to leave. I don't even think you trim it all the way down. I think you trim it like most of the way down. So it's kind of squared up, but you still have some wiggle room and your binding's not on yet, right? So I would guess about 1 inch of batting on each side, and you wet it and kind of get the extra out, right? Or I think you can even spray it, but it's got to be pretty darn wet, right? And then you're going to lay it out. People usually do them on foam boards, and they use T-pins, and you literally take your ruler and you square that puppy up. Right? And then you let it dry with all those edges pinned where it's square and flat. And then you put your binding on. And then to my understanding, you don't wash it again after that, right? Because it's now square. I have not done this. This is on my list of things to do and share with you guys. But you could look up how to block a quilt, and that'll give you the information you need. And if you've already got the binding on, I think you could just pop the binding off and do this, would be my guess. Oh my gosh, Robin, that's amazing. Peace oil is one of my favorites. The vetiver in there, it's so good and calming. Hey, Patricia. I love that. Oh, perfect. Yes, yes, yes. Don't know if anyone else does this. You try to use a big piece of glass. Yes, you absolutely can take plexiglass, or if you've got like an old picture frame, pull the glass out of it. Now, word of caution, take, whether it's plexiglass or glass, take duct tape, something that's a bright color, and put it around the edges. One, if it's glass, it'll help you not cut yourself. But two, that way you know where the edges are. Because I have heard horror stories of folks who are happily doodling along and they wander off the plexiglass, and then they have to figure out how to get the marker out of their quilt, right? So make sure you know where your edges are. Yay, Lisa. Oh, you love your glide foot, Sherry. I'm so glad to hear that. Hey, Francie Joe. You can get them for domestic machines as well as for long arms. That's going to be a shank height thing, which I know approximately, like we just exhausted my knowledge of shank heights. I know they're high. There's like full shank and like not full shank. Guys, I'm not an expert on sewing machine shanks, but I know that that matters and you get the appropriate shank height, even, or a smooth glide, whatever, glide foot for your machine. But I do know that you can put them on both domestics and long arms. Yeah. Excellent, excellent. All right, guys. This was so much fun. So, all right. My encouragements to you, if this topic has excited you, if you're interested by it, if you're wanting to learn more about quilting your own quilts, even just for your smaller quilts, right? Like I know plenty of people that they love to quilt their throw size quilts, but maybe quilt by check for their larger quilts. Or maybe you're on the path to a long arm, or maybe you want to tackle that big puppy on your domestic machine. Whatever your path is in quilting your own quilts, I encourage you, if you've not already, to take beginner free motion quilting. That teaches you 10 motifs. That's a really good toolbox to make quilting plans from, right? Remember, the fewer motifs you know, the harder making quilting plans will be, because you'll have fewer options, right? Like you'll be like, oh, well, I already used switchbacks, so I don't want to use them again, but I don't have any other border motifs in my back pocket. Right, so I really recommend having a toolbox of at least those 10 motifs if you've not done that already, and then how to make a quilting plan. How to make a quilting plan is going to pick up right where we've left off, right? I've given you guys this big picture, and how to make a quilting plan jumps in with different motifs for different shapes on your quilt, right? So obviously the emphasis there is more on semi-custom quilting and on custom quilting. If your interest is largely in overall designs, then just beginner free motion quilting is probably the path for you. But I encourage you just to think about even this semi-custom idea of just being able to put a couple little surprises in your quilting. And how to make a quilting plan is going to walk you through shape by shape, so you can begin to look not only at the shapes where your seam lines are, but maybe even bigger than that, right? Like, what if I could quilt just this square, or I could quilt this square, right? Or I could quilt this square, right? So even though within the class I walk you through largely paying attention to seam lines, also start thinking about how you could break out of those seam lines. Again, these are ideas I'm chewing on for future classes. But to get started, those are the 2 classes I recommend. I so have loved being with you guys today. I love that, Bonnie. Yay, Jan. I can't wait to have you in Rockstar. It's going to be so great. Thank you for joining me. Enjoy the blog. Thank you to all of you who asked questions. One of you will actually win a seat in beginner free motion quilting. Or if, and I'm going to go ahead and put this out there, if you win and you already have beginner, you'll win a seat in how to make a quilting plan. So you'll win one or the other, whichever one you don't yet have. Okay? I don't want you to sit around holding your breath for 5 days wanting to take the class, but wanting to know if you won. Okay? So there are options, folks, options. Thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to like and share this video. I love being here with you guys. Oh, Patricia, a glide foot, it's like a little clear plastic foot that looks like a spoon, and then there's a hole in it for your needle. So it goes over bulky seams, easier than something like a ruler foot or a hopping foot, right? Thank you for joining me. Go check out the blog where you'll see an overview of most of what we've talked about today. Y'all had some really great questions. If you jumped in at the end, I encourage you to go back and watch from the beginning, because your fellow rock stars had awesome things to add. These classes are only available on demand via Thinkific. So if you go to my website, you'll find them there. If you are interested in an in-person class, I do offer these classes if I travel to guilds to do workshops. So you can get it in person, but as far as taking it online, it's available on demand. And it's all pre-recorded for you and it's ready to go. You have challenges at the end of each section, so you step through just like if I were stepping you through an in-person class, that you'll pause and do the work and return. And if you have questions at any point, feel free to email me or jump inside the Quilting Rockstars. All right, guys, I will see you tomorrow night inside the Quilting Rockstars Facebook group for social hour. I've just absolutely loved this time. I love hanging out with you guys, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.